At 2:14 p.m., the organ stopped. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on the back wall for the last 7 minutes, doing the only thing an ICU nurse knows how to do when everything is falling apart. Counting, measuring, trying to understand the situation before the patient flatlined. My bouquet held 26 white roses. 26, because Ethan had always called it our number. The day we met was June 26, the apartment number where we shared our first kiss. The number of hours in a day, he'd once whispered, and every one of them is where I want to be with you, Claire. I'd rolled my eyes. I'd kept the roses anyway. Now the thorns were digging into my palms. I never let go. 400 guests were staring at me. Colored light from the stained glass windows spilled across the marble floor, and for one strange second I thought how beautiful it looked, as if even disaster could seem graceful inside a church. Behind me, my bridesmaids had gone completely silent. My maid of honor, Dr. Nicole Harper, one of the calmest trauma surgeons I'd ever met, reached out once and touched my shoulder. I gently pulled away without looking at her. I couldn't stop watching the front pew. She sat there with one leg crossed over the other. A glass of red wine rested between her fingers as though she were attending an art exhibition instead of her son's wedding. Victoria Brooks, Ethan's mother. She wasn't wearing champagne. She wasn't wearing ivory. She wasn't wearing anything remotely appropriate for the mother of the groom. She wore a silver sequined gown with a neckline that plunged low and a slit that climbed high. The dress probably cost more than mine. It silently declared exactly what she had believed from the beginning. This day belonged to her. I was only decoration. She never once called Ethan. That was when I knew. If your son is 45 minutes late to his own wedding, you call him. You pace. You send people looking. You panic. You do something. Victoria Brooks simply sat there sipping her wine, smiling politely at familiar faces. She never reached for her phone. She already knew. I should explain how I ended up standing at an altar in front of 400 people, bleeding into my wedding dress, while the woman I'd spent 3 years trying to impress quietly destroyed my life. The short answer is simple. Love makes intelligent people ignore obvious warning signs. The longer answer begins 18 months earlier. Ethan walked into the emergency department at St. Gabriel Medical Center with a shallow cut on his forearm and an ego far more serious than the injury. He was handsome. Admitting that still embarrasses me. Dark hair, sharp jaw, long fingers that looked like they belonged at a piano instead of behind a laptop. He worked as a financial analyst at Orion Holdings, which sounded successful without meaning much to me. He joked while I stitched his arm. When I finished, he asked for my number. I gave it to him. It was the most impulsive decision I'd made in years. For a long time, it also felt like the best one. He had a way of making you feel like the most important person in every room. He remembered tiny details. A story about my grandmother's peach pie. The professor I'd hated in nursing school. Little things I'd forgotten I'd even said. Weeks later, he'd casually bring them up, making me believe he'd listened to every word. Flowers appeared after difficult shifts. He learned enough medical terminology to ask about my work without sounding clueless. Looking back, there was one habit I ignored. Every time his mother called, he disappeared into another room. The conversations were always long. His voice always became quieter. Whenever I asked what they talked about, he'd smile without quite meeting my eyes. "She's just worried," he'd say. "You know how mothers are." I didn't. My mother died when I was 12. My father raised me alone in a small apartment outside Columbus until he passed away during my final year of nursing school. He worked endless overtime, left homemade dinners in the refrigerator, and taped notes on every container reminding me to eat. I never knew what having a mother was supposed to look like. So every excuse Ethan gave sounded reasonable, until it didn't. 3 months before the wedding, Victoria Brooks inserted herself into every decision. She replaced my florist, canceled my cake designer, and hired her own. Met privately with the venue coordinator without telling me. A week later, I discovered the seating chart had changed. My coworkers from St. Gabriel had been moved to the back of the ballroom. When I confronted Ethan, he sighed. "She means well. She just has strong opinions." "I have opinions too," I replied. "I know. But I can't fight her over everything." I remember hearing the word can't and convincing myself it wasn't the same as won't. 6 weeks before the wedding, Ethan started staying late at work. That wasn't unusual. He'd been promoted twice in 1 year, and his CEO, Alexander Blackwood, had a reputation for expecting absolute commitment. I'd only seen Blackwood once. It was at a charity gala Ethan invited me to months earlier. He stood across the ballroom surrounded by executives, tall, quiet, perfectly dressed, the kind of man who barely moved while everyone else adjusted themselves around him. I remember thinking he looked like someone who had never been caught off guard. Ethan's late nights didn't bother me. What bothered me was his phone. It suddenly went everywhere with him, even into the bathroom. A small thing, or at least I kept telling myself it was. 2 weeks before the wedding, I came home early after an overnight shift. I was still wearing my scrubs. The apartment was quiet. As I walked toward the bedroom, I heard Ethan speaking in the kitchen. He didn't know I was home. His voice was low. Careful. Mother, it's handled. No, she doesn't know. Yes, I know about Ashford. I'll be careful. I stopped walking. Ashford? I didn't know anyone named Ashford. Before he could leave the kitchen, I quietly stepped back into the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was work. Maybe it was a vendor. Maybe it had something to do with the wedding. I explained everything away, exactly the way people in love always do. Over the next 2 weeks, I finished planning the wedding, picked up my dress, went to my final fitting with Nicole. She stood behind me, smiling at my reflection. "My God, Claire," she whispered, "you look incredible." I smiled back. I believed her. At least I wanted to. At 2:21 p.m., Victoria Brooks finally stood. She rose slowly from the front pew with the confidence of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Someone handed her a microphone. To this day, I don't know who. 1 second, it wasn't there. The next, she was walking toward me with a glass of red wine in one hand and a microphone in the other. I stood less than a meter away. I couldn't move. "There won't be a wedding today," she announced. The entire church inhaled at once. 400 people. One shared breath. My fingers tightened around the roses. Another thorn buried itself in my palm. The pain grounded me. It was real. Something I could still measure. "My son," Victoria continued calmly, "is across town with Charlotte Ashford." She smiled. A woman with breeding. A woman with wealth. A woman whose family opens the right doors. Then she looked directly into my eyes. "You were never the destination, sweetheart. You were simply keeping his bed warm while he climbed. Nothing more than a placeholder." The word landed harder than anything else. I had watched people receive terminal diagnoses. I knew exactly what it looked like when someone's entire understanding of their life shattered in a single sentence. I had seen that expression countless times. Now it belonged to me. Victoria stepped closer. She reached up and grabbed my cathedral veil where it was pinned into my hair. "White?" she said with a laugh. "Really?" She yanked. The comb tore across my scalp. A sharp line of pain shot through my head. Warm blood trickled down beside my temple. My carefully pinned hair collapsed over my shoulders. I stood there bleeding, still unable to move. My training took over. Don't panic. Don't scream. Stay upright. Breathe. Assess. Count. She lifted her wine glass. Then she smiled. "Let's fix the color." The wine hit before I could react. Cold, sweet, dark red. It soaked through the silk almost instantly. I watched the stains spread across the ivory fabric. It looked disturbingly familiar, like blood spreading across hospital sheets. Except this was one wound I couldn't stop. My knees gave out. Not because I chose to kneel, because my body simply decided it had reached its limit. The marble floor felt cold beneath me. Wine dripped from my dress onto the stone. Somewhere behind me, someone laughed. Real laughter. Bright. Careless. I remember thinking that the worst moment of my life had become entertainment for someone else. Wine dripped from my chin. At the edge of my vision, I saw someone holding up a phone to record everything. "Go back to changing bedpans, nurse," Victoria said. Then I heard footsteps, slow, steady, measured. Every step carried absolute certainty. The laughter stopped. The room changed. Anyone who has worked in emergency medicine knows the feeling when chaos suddenly gives way to complete order because someone important has entered the room. I felt it before I looked up. Alexander Blackwood knelt beside me on the wine-soaked marble. His charcoal suit probably cost more than most people's cars. He didn't seem to care. He looked directly into my eyes. The same way I look at patients who are about to give up. "Look at me," he said quietly. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. "Don't fall apart. You're about to win." Alexander Blackwood helped me to my feet. I rose slowly, unsteady in my heels. For 2 weeks, I'd practiced walking down that aisle. Now I stood beside a man I barely knew, trusting him for reasons I couldn't explain. He faced the guests. He never asked for the microphone. He didn't need one. 3 years ago, he said, I was trapped inside a burning car on Interstate 81. The church became completely silent. I was conscious long enough to watch dozens of people slow down, stare, take photographs, and drive away. No one moved. Then he continued. One person stopped. She broke the driver's window with her bare hands. She pulled me from the vehicle. She used her own clothing to stop the bleeding until paramedics arrived. And before anyone could thank her, she disappeared. Then he turned toward me. Suddenly I remembered, 3 years earlier, a double shift at St. Gabriel, driving home in my old Honda, smoke rising beside the highway, pulling over before I'd even realized I'd made the decision, because that's what emergency nurses do. I remembered smashing the window, calling 911, dragging an unconscious man out of the burning car, packing the wound on his chest with pieces of my scrub top, leaving before anyone asked my name because I had another shift in 4 hours. I'd never told anyone, not even Nicole. To me, it had simply been another difficult day. Victoria Brooks had gone completely pale. For the first time all afternoon, she wasn't smiling. As for Charlotte Ashford, Alexander continued, his voice growing colder, she is an actress. Her real name is Emily Carter. She works for the Westbridge Theater Company. I hired her 11 weeks ago. Victoria's microphone slipped from her hand. It struck the marble floor with a sharp burst of feedback before the sound disappeared. What? She whispered. My employee, Alexander said calmly, was engaged to the woman who once saved my life. I discovered that 14 weeks ago during a routine background investigation. He paused. I needed to know what kind of man Ethan Brooks really was. So I created an opportunity, a fictional heiress, a fictional business merger, a fictional fortune. I gave him every chance to choose the woman he claimed to love. He looked toward the empty seat where Ethan should have been. Slot, he abandoned her within 22 hours. He told Emily that his engagement was only temporary. He described Claire Bennett as convenient. He planned to leave her quietly after securing the marriage he truly wanted. The church remained silent. I have every recording. My legal department submitted them this morning as part of an internal ethics investigation. Ethan Brooks was dismissed from Orion Holdings at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. A wave of whispers rolled through the church. Alexander looked directly at Victoria. I also believe you were fully aware of this arrangement. I believe you worked with your son to ensure Claire would stand in this church wearing this dress before as many witnesses as possible. My attorneys will be contacting you. Victoria slowly lowered herself into her seat. At that exact moment, the church doors burst open. Ethan ran inside. His tie hung loose. His shirt was untucked. One shoe wasn't fully tied. He looked like a man who had sprinted several blocks without stopping. Then he saw me, saw Alexander, saw his mother, saw the wine on my dress, and I watched his face change. That moment has stayed with me ever since. He wasn't wondering what had happened to me. He was calculating what had happened to him. Sir, he gasped, looking at Alexander. What is this? Claire, what's going on? Perfect timing, Alexander replied. You may take a seat. You're only a guest now. Ethan walked toward me. He reached for my arm. I let his hand rest there for 1 second, long enough to truly look at him. Sweat covered his forehead. Panic filled his eyes. His mind was racing, searching for a solution, searching for an excuse. I searched his face for guilt, for regret, for concern over the blood running down my temple, for the humiliation I just endured. I found nothing. Not one thought was about me. Claire, he whispered, lowering his voice into the soft tone he always used when he wanted forgiveness. I love you. I made a terrible mistake. My mother has been pushing me for months. I didn't know what to do. I wish I could tell you there was a long, dramatic pause. There wasn't. I opened my hand. The roses slipped from my fingers onto the marble floor. Then I turned toward Alexander. Alexander was watching me with the same calm focus. He wasn't pushing me, wasn't trying to lead me. He was simply there, waiting. I reached up, grabbed the lapels of his jacket, and kissed him. I want to be honest about that moment. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was the decision of a woman who had spent 3 years swallowing every warning sign until there was nothing left to swallow. Only anger, freedom, and the certainty that I would never let anyone humiliate me again. For half a second, he froze. Then his arms wrapped around me, not possessively, not dramatically, just steadily, like someone who had already decided he wasn't letting go. The church was completely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard Ethan make a sound that was half my name, half disbelief. When I stepped back, I turned toward Father Michael Lawson. He had been performing weddings in that church for more than 20 years. He looked from Alexander to me, then back again, wearing the most confused expression I'd ever seen on a priest. "I do," I said. Of course, it wasn't legally possible. There were licenses, paperwork, requirements. Father Lawson would explain all of that much later over tea. But in that moment, he looked at the woman standing before him in a ruined wedding dress, blood still drying near her hairline, and simply nodded. He quietly spoke the words. Behind us, Ethan shouted. The sound echoed through the church. Only then did I notice two security officers standing near the entrance. They moved immediately. Within seconds, Ethan was being escorted back down the aisle, still yelling my name. The doors closed behind him. Silence returned. The entire ceremony lasted barely 11 minutes. The bridal suite was almost painfully white. White walls, white curtains, white vanity lights surrounding the mirror. I stood in front of my reflection, watching red wine drip from the hem of my ruined dress. Old habits returned, scalp laceration, minor, small puncture wounds in both palms, nothing serious. Wedding dress, total loss. Patient emotionally unstable. Nicole entered without saying a word. She sat beside me and covered my hand with hers. We stayed like that for several minutes. Finally, she smiled. So, Alexander Blackwood? I laughed weakly. I know. He knelt on marble wearing a suit worth more than my student loans. There was a gentle knock. Nicole opened the door. Alexander stood outside holding a garment bag. He looked exactly the same as before, calm, collected, as though the last 2 hours had simply been another complicated business meeting. Most of the guests stayed, he said. The reception is still going. The caterers continued serving. The band started about 10 minutes ago. He hesitated. I thought you might prefer another dress. He handed me the garment bag. I unzipped it. Inside hung a deep crimson silk gown. Floor length. Elegant. Simple. It looked as though it had been tailored specifically for me. I held it against myself. It fits, I whispered. Alexander nodded. It was made for you. I looked at him in surprise. When? 12 weeks ago. He answered without hesitation. After I confirmed you were the woman from the accident. I hoped I'd never need to give it to you. I hoped Ethan would make the right decision. But I wanted you to have another ending if he didn't. I stared at him for a long moment. Who are you? I finally asked, because I genuinely needed the answer. He met my eyes. The man who's been waiting 3 years to answer that question. 14 months later, the lawsuits were over. On the Monday after the wedding, Alexander's attorneys filed a civil case against Victoria Brooks. The claims included intentional emotional harm and fraudulent contracts she had signed with the venue and vendors while presenting the wedding as a legitimate event. Even that surprised me. A forensic psychologist hired by Alexander's legal team later submitted an expert evaluation supporting the case. Victoria's attorneys settled before trial. When my lawyer, Rebecca Collins, who had spent 3 decades handling civil litigation and had absolutely no patience for manipulation, told me the settlement amount, she simply called it substantial. That was enough for me. Ethan's dismissal from Orion Holdings remained in effect. He attempted to sue the company for wrongful termination. The case was dismissed a few months later. I heard through an old coworker that he'd moved back into his mother's house after losing his apartment. I didn't spend much time thinking about it. The recordings Alexander had mentioned were entered into evidence. I listened to them once. Only once. Rebecca insisted I should hear everything before the case ended. Nicole sat beside me the entire time, holding my hand, listening to Ethan calmly explain why I was convenient. How he planned to leave me after securing Charlotte Ashford's fortune. It hurt, but not the way I expected. It felt less like discovering a betrayal and more like finally receiving proof of something I'd refused to admit for a very long time. The wound had already existed. Someone had simply cleaned it. What I didn't expect was the video. Someone had recorded everything inside the church. Of course they had. There were 400 guests. Someone always records. The video lasted just over 9 minutes. It began when Victoria poured wine over my dress. It ended with Alexander helping me back to my feet. Before I had even changed clothes, it had already appeared online. By Monday morning, it had been viewed more than 11 million times. By Wednesday, major news websites were covering the story. I avoided reading most of it. I read only enough to realize people had understood something important. They saw a trauma nurse who had finished a 6-hour shift before her own wedding because a coworker needed help. They saw a woman publicly humiliated who never screamed, never fought, never begged. They decided she deserved a better ending. A few months later, Alexander and I were married properly, legally, quietly. On a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse, Nicole signed as my witness. Alexander's chief financial officer signed as his. Afterward, we walked to a small Italian restaurant nearby. No reservations, no photographers, no guests. I wore a navy blue dress, comfortable shoes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I simply enjoyed dinner. At one point, Alexander said something so unexpectedly dry that I laughed. A real laugh. He looked at me for a moment. "What?" I asked. He smiled. "I've been waiting to hear that." "Hear what?" "Your laugh." I wasn't sure I'd ever earn it. I looked at him across the table. "What do you mean?" "The dress, the restaurant, everything. I wanted tonight to feel right for you." For the first time since we'd met, Alexander Blackwood looked uncertain. It was strangely endearing. I thought about the man who had searched for the stranger who saved his life, who had quietly protected me without asking for anything, who had knelt beside me on a marble floor while everyone else watched. "It's perfect," I told him. I still work at St. Gabriel Medical Center. That surprises people. They ask why I never left. The answer has always been simple. Because I love what I do. Because people still need help. Because an emergency room doesn't care about your income, your last name, or what happened on your wedding day. Pain is pain, and someone always needs another pair of hands. Sometimes I come home after difficult night shifts. Alexander is usually awake, reading. He hands me a cup of tea without asking questions. He knows I'll talk when I'm ready. He has learned my silence the same way good doctors learn their patients. Without forcing it. 6 months after the settlement, Victoria sent me a letter. I never opened it. I handed it directly to Rebecca. She later told me it sounded like an apology, or perhaps a legal strategy disguised as one. Either way, I never asked to read it. As for Ethan, I only heard about him once more. Someone mentioned he'd become engaged again to a woman from an influential family. The person telling me clearly expected some kind of reaction. I thought about it for a moment. Then I smiled. I hope she has an excellent attorney. That was the last time I ever discussed Ethan Brooks.